Somewhere in the Atlantic Ocean, roughly halfway between Florida and the Bermuda Islands, the water changes color. Not the way the sky changes at sunset, gradually, giving the eye time to adjust. It happens differently here. Blue, almost turquoise near the shore, and then suddenly, at an invisible line, deep indigo, almost black, as though beneath you there is no longer a sandy bottom 300 feet down, but an abyss 3 miles deep. Sailors who passed through these waters often enough used to say there was something like a character to that line, something almost alive, not threatening, not hostile, just other. Different sounds, different movement in the swells, a different quality of silence. This place has many names. The Devil's Triangle, the Triangle of Death, but most often, simply the Bermuda Triangle. 3 points on a map: Miami to the west, the Bermuda Islands to the north, Puerto Rico to the south, roughly 200,000 square miles of water, about the size of Texas. And in that water, if the chronicles are to be believed, more than 50 ships and 20 aircraft have vanished without trace over the past 200 years. People, cargo, wreckage, all of it simply stopped existing. Before we go any further, write in the comments what city you're listening from tonight. I keep a geography of my listeners, and one day I'll make something from those places. And if you haven't subscribed yet, this is a good moment. There are more of these coming. Let us begin with the strangest thing, with a paradox that sits at the center of this entire story and that almost nobody mentions. The Bermuda Triangle officially does not exist. It has never existed. The United States Navy does not recognize it as any special geographic zone. The US Board on Geographic Names has never included it in any official atlas. Lloyd's of London, the insurance company that will insure absolutely anything, from a Picasso to an opera singer's vocal cords, does not consider sailing through the Bermuda Triangle a higher risk than sailing anywhere else in the Atlantic. Same rates, same actuarial tables. And yet, this is one of the most famous places on Earth. Children in school know the name, films are made, books are written, expeditions are launched. How does it happen that a place that doesn't exist takes up so much space in the human imagination? Maybe it's because some stories are too good for a simple explanation, too full of that particular, almost sweet anxiety you feel when you lie in the dark and think about something very large and very far away, about a depth that cannot be measured, about a distance that cannot be walked, about people who simply vanished, not died, not perished in a wreck, but vanished, as if the world folded them into a pocket and forgot about them. Let me tell you what this place actually is. Not as legend, but as physical reality. Because sometimes knowing what lies beneath you creates a particular kind of calm. Not fear, but something closer to respect for scale. The Bermuda Triangle sits in the northwestern Atlantic Ocean. Its boundaries are described differently in different sources. There is, remember, no official definition, and various researchers drew the triangle slightly differently. But the 3 points are usually taken as Miami on the Florida coast, the Bermuda Islands in the open ocean, and Puerto Rico to the southeast. The area within those 3 points ranges from about 200,000 to nearly 400,000 square miles, depending on how you draw the lines. For comparison, that is larger than the states of Texas, California, and Montana combined. This is an enormous piece of water, and across this enormous piece of water, every single day, thousands of vessels pass. This is one of the busiest maritime corridors in the world. Cargo ships from Europe bound for the Caribbean and back, cruise ships, fishing boats, yachts, ferries, and hundreds of aircraft cross the triangle by air daily. It is one of the most congested air corridors on Earth. If the triangle were genuinely, anomalously dangerous, we would know it from annual statistics. But the statistics say otherwise. The rate of losses here is no different from comparable regions elsewhere. This is important knowledge, not because it kills the legend. The legend is too alive and too necessary to be killed by a percentage, but because it allows us to separate the legend from fear. The legend is a good thing. The fear, optional. Let us start with the oldest of these stories, the one that happened 70 years before the word triangle was ever connected to this place. December 5th, 1872. A Canadian brigantine called the Dei Gratia moves slowly across the Atlantic, about 400 nautical miles east of the Azores. The weather is calm, the wind light, the horizon clear. The watchman spots another vessel ahead, moving strangely, sideways, in lurches, as though the helmsman is drunk, or no one is at the wheel at all. The captain of the Dei Gratia, a man named David Morehouse, raises his binoculars. The rigging is partly furled, partly hanging in disarray. On deck, not the slightest sign of life. Morehouse sends a boat. When his men climb aboard, they find the ship in a state of almost eerie order. The cabins are neat. Personal belongings are stowed. In the galley, signs of recent cooking. In the hold, 1,701 barrels of industrial alcohol, the entire cargo untouched. The ship's log is kept carefully up to November 25th. After that date, blank pages. The compass is smashed. The single lifeboat is gone. The ship was called the Mary Celeste. Her captain was Benjamin Briggs, 37 years old, an experienced sailor from Massachusetts, a man of spotless reputation, a teetotaler and a committed Christian. The kind of man who, everyone who knew him agreed, would never abandon a vessel under any storm unless his life faced direct and immediate danger. On board with him were his wife Sarah and their 2-year-old daughter Sophia, and 7 experienced sailors, 10 people. Not one of them was ever seen again. Investigators found several details that fit no rational version of events. Food on the table was nearly ready to be served, as though people had stood up and walked out in the middle of a meal. Beds in the cabins rumpled from sleep, valuables and personal belongings in place. Sarah Briggs's sewing machine standing where it always stood. Her music book open, as if someone had just stopped playing. The strangest detail, the sounding rod used to check water levels in the hold was lying on the deck, meaning someone had just used it. One of the pumps was disassembled. This suggested the captain may have believed the ship was sinking. But the ship was not sinking. It was floating perfectly well. Where the answer was hiding, somewhere between those two facts, no one has ever been able to work out. In a century and a half, the theories have accumulated impressively. But before the theories, there is one more detail from the Mary Celeste that I cannot leave out. When the De Gratia's men first boarded the empty ship, one of them, a sailor named Oliver Deveau, went below to the captain's cabin. There he found the water level gauge still deployed from the morning's check. He found that the hatch over the forward hold was open, and he found, in the ship's log, the last entry. Monday, 25th, at 8 o'clock, Eastern Point bears south-southwest, 6 miles distant. Eastern point of the island of Santa Maria in the Azores, 6 miles. This is the last position recorded by anyone aboard the Mary Celeste. 6 miles from land. If they had needed to reach shore, they could have reached it, if they had a lifeboat, which they did. The lifeboat was gone. All the evidence suggested a rapid departure, panic perhaps, or a sudden perceived emergency. The most plausible explanation today, and it is genuinely only a possibility, involves those barrels of alcohol in the hold. Industrial alcohol was not always stored in perfectly sealed barrels. 9 of the 1,701 barrels were later found to be empty, slightly damp. If alcohol vapor had built up and a small explosion or fire occurred, not enough to damage the ship, but alarming enough to convince a careful, conscientious captain that something catastrophic was about to happen, he might have ordered everyone into the lifeboat with a long rope to stay close while the danger passed. And then the rope might have broken, or the sea been rougher than it looked, or the lifeboat, overloaded with 10 people in rough swells, simply swamped. In 15 minutes, the Gulf Stream could have separated them from the ship. In an hour, the ship could have been invisible over the horizon. And 10 people in an open boat in November swells in the Atlantic, without fresh water, without food, without shelter, had very little time. This explanation is plausible. It is also unverifiable, which is how the Mary Celeste has remained for 150 years, suspended between the possible and the unknown. In a century and a half, the theories have accumulated impressively. A pirate attack, a mutiny, a sudden waterspout, an explosion of alcohol vapors that panicked the captain enough to order everyone off the ship. There is even a version involving a giant squid, and a version in which Briggs and the captain of the De Gratia, who were, it should be noted, old friends who had dined together the evening before both ships sailed, cooked something up for insurance purposes. The insurance investigation didn't support it. The Mary Celeste doesn't technically belong to the Bermuda Triangle in the strict sense. The ship was found near the Azores, different waters, different coordinates. But this is the story that first created the image that later attached itself to the triangle permanently. An empty ship sailing itself, and 10 people dissolved in the water like a cube of sugar in warm tea. Now let us jump forward 70 years. The war has just ended, September 1945. The world is exhaling after 6 years of horror, and the Naval Air Station at Fort Lauderdale, Florida, is doing what it always did, training pilots. Routine training flights over the Atlantic, everything quiet, the danger behind them, or so it seemed. December 5th, 1945, at exactly 2:10 in the afternoon, 5 TBM Avenger torpedo bombers lift off the runway. This is Flight 19, a training route east toward the Bahamas, then a turn north, then back to base. 3 hours, no more. The commander is Lieutenant Charles Taylor, 28 years old, 2,500 hours of flight time, several combat missions in the Pacific. Experienced, calm, dependable. 14 men, good weather, excellent visibility. 2 hours later, contact with the base grows strange. What Taylor says sounds off. Both of his compasses, primary and backup, have failed simultaneously. He doesn't know where he is. He thinks he flew over the Florida Keys, though he should be near the Bahamas, about 120 miles from his estimated position. The other pilots report the same thing. The instruments are behaving unpredictably. The ocean below doesn't look the way it's supposed to look. The controllers on the ground try to help. The conversation cuts out, comes back, cuts out again. Taylor declines the offer to hand command over to another pilot whose compass is still working. He leads the group northeast, then somewhere else. The voice on the radio grows increasingly strained. The fuel is running low. At 9:45 in the evening, a civilian vessel reports a flash of light over the water. Flight 19 stopped making contact. 6 planes and 27 men. A search aircraft, a PBM Mariner flying boat with 13 crew, was sent after them. It also didn't return. Searches went on for days. 300,000 square miles were covered. No wreckage, no oil slick, no trace. The official conclusion of the Navy's investigation into Flight 19: cause unknown. 30 years later, in 1974, an American writer named Charles Berlitz published a book called The Bermuda Triangle. It sold roughly 20 million copies and became one of the most read non-fiction works of the 20th century. Berlitz gathered the scattered stories of disappearances into a single narrative, drew a map with a triangle on it, and named the space between the dots. After that book, the phrase Bermuda Triangle entered the languages of the world so permanently that it no longer needed explanation. But before Berlitz, there was something else, something rarely discussed, though it may be the most unsettling story in the whole collection. March 1918. World War I is not yet over. The USS Cyclops, a massive coal transport, one of the largest vessels in the Navy, 540 feet long, leaves the port of Barbados and sets course for Baltimore. On board, 306 people. The cargo, nearly 11,000 tons of manganese ore. Last known position, March 4th, Barbados. Expected arrival in Baltimore, March 13th. The ship did not arrive. No distress signals were received. No wreckage was ever found. No trace. 306 people. A ship weighing nearly 20,000 tons. Simply gone. The United States Navy has never closed this case. The official language still reads, "The disappearance of this vessel remains one of the most baffling mysteries in the annals of the Navy." President Woodrow Wilson said at the time something that was quoted many times afterward. "Only God and the sea know what happened to that great ship." The Cyclops was carrying manganese ore, an unusually dense cargo, nearly 11,000 tons of it. Manganese ore is also notoriously unstable as a ship's cargo. It can shift in the hold, especially in rough weather, changing the vessel's center of gravity in ways that can capsize even a large ship with surprising speed. A single significant roll and the weight moves, and the ship doesn't come back upright. There were also reports, recorded in the Navy's investigation, that the Cyclops was in poor mechanical condition when it sailed. One of its 2 engines was disabled. The ship was sailing on one engine, overloaded, with a cargo prone to shifting, in weather that was not calm for the full length of the voyage. This might explain the absence of a distress signal. If the ship capsized suddenly, as an unstable load in rough weather might cause, there would have been no time to transmit. A ship that size, going down quickly, can create a significant underwater disturbance. The displacement of water as it sinks can scatter wreckage over a wide area, and ocean currents can then distribute that wreckage further. With 1918 technology, no satellite imagery, no automated position tracking, search efforts in the right area could still have missed everything. This is a reasonable explanation. It is supported by some evidence, and it still doesn't entirely satisfy, because the Cyclops was 540 feet long, and ships that size, even when they sink quickly, usually leave something. The ocean usually gives back something. The silence from the Cyclops has been, for more than a century, genuinely total. Only God and the sea know what happened to that great ship. There is something particular about the way the night is constructed. During the day, the mind is occupied with 1,000 small things, and the large questions retreat to the background. But at night, especially in these minutes when the body has nearly relaxed and the thoughts haven't quite gone quiet yet, that's when the questions come that have no easy answers. How can ships the size of an office building vanish? Where do people go when they were just here, just eating, just looking at the same water everyone else was looking at? Perhaps that's why these stories are told so well at night. They're made of the same material as darkness, space without edges, silence without answer. The human mind cannot tolerate a vacuum. If there is no explanation, it creates one. And over a century, the explanations for the Bermuda Triangle have multiplied into something approaching an encyclopedia. Let us walk through them, not to choose the right one, but simply to see how differently people look at the same dark patch of water. The first and most popular paranormal theory: extraterrestrials. The idea that beneath the Atlantic there exists a base of an alien civilization that periodically collects samples, ships, planes, people, the way a researcher takes soil samples. This version appeared in the 1960s with the first wave of interest in flying saucers and has never lost its audience. Steven Spielberg, incidentally, played with this in his 1977 film Close Encounters of the Third Kind. In a scene many people consider one of the best in the picture, ships and planes from Flight 19, perfectly intact as if just off the assembly line, appear in the middle of a desert. Returned, simply returned without explanation. The second theory, Atlantis. More precisely, its energy crystals. According to this view, the legendary sunken continent lies beneath the waters of the Triangle, and its power installations, enormous crystalline generators that once supplied the Atlanteans with energy, are still operating, sporadically emitting fields that scramble navigational instruments and destroy the hulls of ships. This version is beautiful, the way an old map with sea monsters in the corners is beautiful. Hard to believe, but pleasant to imagine might be true. The third theory, time portals. Tears in the fabric of space-time through which ships and aircraft slip into a different era or dimension. This idea connects to something real, the reports of pilots and sailors who experienced profound disorientation in these waters. Let me tell you more about Bruce Gernon, because his account is the most detailed and the most difficult to dismiss entirely. In December 1970, Gernon was piloting a small Beechcraft Bonanza from the Bahamas to Miami. Near the Bimini Islands, he noticed an unusual cloud formation, a lens-shaped cloud directly in his path. As he climbed above it, it began to grow rapidly and surround him, forming what he described as a tunnel. The clouds were rotating. The tunnel was pulling him in. He passed through. When he emerged, his compass was spinning. His instruments showed Miami below him, but he had only been flying for 47 minutes, and at his speed, Miami was at least 75 minutes from his departure point. The controllers at Miami confirmed his position. He had traveled 100 miles in what should have taken 30 more minutes. Gernon spent years analysing what happened and came up with his own theory. A form of electronic fog, a naturally occurring phenomenon in the atmosphere over the Gulf Stream that could affect instruments and distort the experience of time. He is not a crank. He is a professional pilot with decades of experience, and his account has been consistent for more than 50 years. Whether what he experienced was a genuine anomaly in the space-time fabric, an unusual meteorological phenomenon affecting his instruments in ways not yet fully understood, or something he experienced and remembered with genuine conviction but cannot be verified, this is not a simple question to answer. It is a genuinely open one. The third theory, time portals. Tears in the fabric of space-time through which ships and aircraft slip into a different era or dimension. This idea is fed by accounts from several pilots who flew through the Triangle and described a sensation of a white fog into which sky and earth disappeared. And when the fog lifted, they found themselves in a completely different position. One such account belongs to an American pilot named Bruce Gernon, who in 1970 described how his aircraft passed through a strange rotating tunnel of cloud and apparently gained almost 30 minutes of flight time, arriving over Miami considerably earlier than was physically possible at his speed and with his fuel load. Whether this is instrument error, disorientation, or something else remains genuinely open. These are theories that cannot be proved or disproved. They exist in the space where science ends and something else begins, something everyone names with their own word. But there are other theories, ones that can be tested, ones that have laboratories and data behind them. Beneath the floor of the Atlantic, in layers of sedimentary rock, lie enormous deposits of a substance called methane hydrate, something between ice and gas, molecules of methane trapped inside cages of frozen water molecules. It looks like white ice. It burns like natural gas, and there is a great deal of it in this region. The Blake Ridge, a particularly rich deposit, lies just north of the Bermuda Triangle, almost on its border. Here is the key. Under certain conditions, changes in pressure, changes in water temperature, these methane hydrates can suddenly destabilize. And when they do, enormous bubbles of gas rise from the ocean floor. Not one bubble, but a cascade, a wall of bubbles that changes the density of the water at the surface. Scientists from Southern Methodist University, including geophysicist Ben Frampus, have documented that exactly these kinds of deposits exist along the Atlantic coast of North America. And in 2003, researchers publishing in the American Journal of Physics built a scale model of a ship and released a large gas bubble beneath it in a water tank. When the ship was positioned directly above the bubble, it instantly lost buoyancy and sank. Quickly, without leaving surface debris, almost without trace. This doesn't mean methane hydrates explain every disappearance. Scientists are careful with the language. But it does mean the physical mechanism exists, that the ocean can, under specific circumstances, literally swallow a ship so quickly and so completely that nothing remains on the surface. There is another scientific theory mentioned less often, but one that strikes me as particularly interesting. It involves sound. Infrasound, acoustic vibrations below 20 Hz, which the human ear cannot detect, but which the body can physically feel, was studied by a British scientist named Vic Tandy in the 1970s. He discovered something curious. Vibrations at around 18 Hz cause people to experience unexplained anxiety, a sense of malevolent presence, sometimes visual disturbances and disorientation. Under certain weather conditions, particularly when large ocean swells move in a specific pattern against a ship's hull, they can generate exactly this kind of infrasound. If this theory holds any water, it would explain something in the accounts of people who described a sudden, unmotivated terror of the sea. Panic without obvious cause. The decision to abandon a ship that could actually have been saved. Physical fear embedded in a wave, invisible, inaudible, but felt in every cell of the body. Here is a fact worth thinking about in the dark. Most of the disappearances attributed to the Bermuda Triangle occurred before 1970, before satellite navigation, before the global air traffic monitoring system, before the widespread use of emergency beacons that begin transmitting automatically the moment they touch water. After the 1970s, the number of documented mysterious disappearances dropped sharply, almost to zero. This either means technology solved the problem, or that there never was a problem, only people and ships of that era without the means to tell the world what had happened to them. Both explanations are plausible, and both are, in their own way, a little sad. The Bermuda Islands themselves, the 3 points on the map that gave the triangle its name, deserve a moment on their own. This is the northernmost coral island group in the world, a small archipelago in the middle of the Atlantic, discovered in 1509 by a Spanish mariner named Juan de Bermudez. The islands spent years with a dark reputation among sailors, not because of the triangle, but simply because the reefs surrounding them were almost invisible beneath the surface and destroyed a great many ships. Sailors called them the Islands of the Devil, Islas del Diablo. On old charts, notes appeared beside the coastlines, something like, "Danger, many reefs." That ancient warning became a legend. The legend grew, and now this small archipelago stands in the title of one of the most famous myths of the modern world. The Bermudians themselves have varying relationships with this reputation. Some take it with humor. There are local bars called the Bermuda Triangle, serving a cocktail of the same name. Some are a little tired of it, since the real islands, quiet, green, genuinely peaceful, have almost nothing in common with the image of a demonic place that swallows ships. The actual Bermuda Islands are remarkable for different reasons. They have the oldest parliament in the Western Hemisphere outside of Britain, founded in 1620. They have some of the most spectacular coral reefs in the Atlantic, and they exist because of an underwater volcano that erupted about 100 million years ago, built a seamount up from the ocean floor, and whose summit now protrudes 40 feet above the waterline as the only dry land within hundreds of miles. The islands exist because of geological violence so ancient it doesn't register as violence at all anymore. Just an archipelago of pink sand beaches in the middle of a warm ocean. There are other places on Earth that carry similar reputations. The Bermuda Triangle is the most famous, but not the only one. In the Pacific Ocean, south of Japan, between the Ryukyu Islands and the Bonin Islands, there is a region that Japanese fishermen and sailors called the Sea of the Devil, and that Westerners sometimes call the Dragon's Triangle. Unexplained disappearances of fishing vessels were reported there, and compass anomalies were recorded. In 1952, the Japanese government sent a research vessel, the Kaio Maru No. 5, with 22 scientists on board, specifically to study the phenomenon. The ship vanished with its entire crew. Wreckage was found later. The working theory: a sudden submarine volcanic eruption. This part of the Pacific lies within the Ring of Fire, where volcanic activity is historically intense. An explanation that sounds reassuring until you remember the 22 people on board. In the middle of North America, there is something called the Lake Michigan Triangle, a region in the freshwater lake where small aircraft and vessels have disappeared, though on a far more modest scale. There are points in the Indian Ocean that have accumulated their own collections of unexplained stories. This either tells us that our planet is arranged unevenly, that it contains places where things happen differently, or it tells us that the human mind finds patterns everywhere, even where there are none. Where there is risk, legend is born. Where there is legend, people begin counting coincidences, and coincidences, if you want to find them, can be found anywhere. A late night over the Atlantic is something entirely particular. If you've ever taken an overnight transatlantic flight and looked out the window, you know the feeling. Below, absolute darkness, so complete that you can't tell where the water ends and the sky begins. The plane's lights blink in the void. You are flying over the place where 14 airmen once disappeared, and no one knows how. It isn't frightening, it is spacious, as if the world is briefly showing you its actual size, which, in ordinary life, is hidden behind buildings and traffic lights. Now let us return to the people, not to the numbers and theories, but to the people. Because behind every disappearance, behind every entry in the maritime chronicles, stands someone's life, someone's mourning, someone's last conversation. Benjamin Briggs wrote a letter to his mother a few days before sailing. He wrote that the Mary Celeste was in fine shape and that he hoped for a good crossing. He brought his wife and 2-year-old Sophia because the route to Genoa was familiar. Not his first time, nothing unusual. None of them ever wrote anything again. None of them made any apparent mistake. At least, there's no evidence of one. They were simply at sea on an ordinary November day in 1872. And then, they were not. Charles Taylor, the pilot of Flight 19, did not want to fly that day. According to several accounts, he asked to be excused from this particular assignment without giving a reason. The request was denied. He flew. In the radio transmissions, when the situation had already become desperate, one of the pilots said to another something close to, "If we fly past the 31st parallel and we're really over the Gulf of Mexico, we'd better fly east." The voice was calm, almost analytical. People in mortal danger sometimes become very calm. Anyone who has worked in emergency medicine or search and rescue knows this. That calm in the final transmissions stays in the memory longer than any theory. Modern technology has done something interesting to the Bermuda Triangle. It has simultaneously dissolved the mystery and deepened it. Dissolved it because now every ship carries an automatic identification system that broadcasts position and heading every few seconds. Every aircraft is tracked continuously by air traffic radar. Emergency beacons activate automatically on contact with water. In the age of satellite navigation, there is literally nowhere to disappear undetected. And disappearances have indeed become far rarer. But deepened it because the stories that happened before these technologies still have no answers. The data about Flight 19's position wouldn't have saved 14 people in December 1945, because that data didn't exist, and no retrospective investigation can tell us what Charles Taylor saw in that December sky above the darkening ocean, when his compass showed one thing and the water below him looked like something else entirely. Some things leave with the people who were their only witnesses. There is a researcher, an American named Lawrence David Cush, who spent several years meticulously checking each of the documented disappearances in the Bermuda Triangle, one by one, with archival records, insurance documents, Coast Guard reports. His conclusion was sobering for lovers of mystery. Most of the stories are either exaggerated or inaccurate. Some ships supposedly vanished without trace actually sank in storms, just not reported as dramatically as the puzzling cases. Some aircraft crashed in other regions and were incorrectly added to the list. Some mysterious disappearances happened nowhere near the triangle, hundreds of miles away. Kusher concluded that statistically, the Bermuda Triangle is no more dangerous than any other comparably sized area of ocean. Lloyd's of London agrees. And yet, something remains. The Mary Celeste remains. The USS Cyclops remains. Flight 19 remains. 3 stories without answers. 3 stories that don't fit neatly into any of the tidy scientific explanations taken whole. Maybe that's enough. Maybe 3 unexplained stories out of hundreds is not a statistic. Maybe it's just 3 doors with darkness behind them. The ocean is very large. That sounds like a cliché, but we have a poor intuition for how true it is. The world's oceans cover 71% of Earth's surface. Their average depth is about 2.5 miles. Their maximum depth, the Mariana Trench, is nearly 7 miles, where the pressure is 1,000 times that of the atmosphere. We've explored less than 20% of the ocean floor. The remaining 80% is terra incognita, unknown territory, just under water. There may be mountain ranges there we don't know about, craters we haven't imagined, currents that don't follow the textbook. In this context, the fact that things sometimes disappear and are never found seems almost expected. What's remarkable is not that some ships sink without leaving a trace. What's remarkable is that we ever find most of them at all. The Atlantic floor holds the wreckage of roughly 3 million ships sunk across the entire history of seafaring. 3 million ships, an entire underwater city spread across the ocean floor. Some have been found, some are still being searched for. Some, in all probability, will never be found, simply because there is too much space and too little time and money. Let us go deeper into the sea floor itself. In 2015, during a major mapping project of the Western Atlantic floor, researchers found hexagonal structures on the bottom near the Florida coast at a depth of around 300 feet. Regular six-sided formations between 130 and 160 feet across. Some journalists immediately ran headlines. Scientists find explanation for Bermuda Triangle mystery. The researchers themselves were somewhat less excited. Their assessment: these structures were most likely formed by explosive gas venting from the sea floor. When gas exits suddenly, it leaves characteristic craters with unusually straight geometric edges. Similar craters have been found and studied by Norwegian scientists in the Barents Sea. They suggest that in this area, powerful gas releases once occurred, or may still occur, periodically, unpredictably, depending on changes in water pressure and temperature. This is not an explanation of all disappearances. It is another piece of a puzzle. A piece that says the floor of the triangle is not a flat, passive surface. It is an active geological zone doing its own thing by its own rules. And most of those rules we are still only beginning to learn. I want to say something about the scale of the searches that followed each disappearance, because this is part of the story that usually gets skipped. When Flight 19 vanished in December 1945, the Navy launched one of the largest search and rescue operations of its time. 300,000 square miles, hundreds of ships and aircraft, several days of continuous searching. This was a serious operation conducted by professionals with enormous experience. People who had just spent years searching for downed aircraft and sunken ships in the Pacific and Atlantic during the war. They knew how to search. They searched well. And found nothing. This is perhaps the most compelling detail in the entire story. Not the disappearance itself. In wartime, ships and aircraft were lost constantly, and it was terrible but explicable. Rather, the absence of anything whatsoever after a professional search. No oil slick, no fragment, no body. The sea can be brutal, but it almost always leaves traces. In this case, nothing. Over several days, across an enormous area. The Gulf Stream, it should be noted, can carry wreckage 60 miles from the site of a disaster overnight. This is mathematically explainable, but even accounting for that, nothing was found. In days, on a massive search area. Here is a figure who almost never appears in discussions of the triangle, though his story is one of the strangest in the collection. In 1881, a British vessel called the Ellen Austin was crossing the Atlantic when it came upon a small schooner. No people aboard, but in perfect order. The captain of the Ellen Austin decided to put some of his crew on the schooner and escort it to port. The ships were separated by fog. When the fog cleared, the schooner was sailing by itself again, empty. The men placed on board had vanished. According to some versions, the Ellen Austin put another crew on the schooner and again lost it in the fog. And again, when visibility returned, the schooner was empty. This is a story recorded in logs and impossible to fully verify. Too many interpretations added over too many decades of retelling. But it exists. It is held somewhere in the archives as a record of something that happened, or may have happened. And in it is the same note as in all the other stories from this place. People were here, and then they weren't. Objects remained. The people left. In January 1948, 3 years after the disappearance of Flight 19, another disappearance occurred in the same region, spoken of less often. A British passenger aircraft, a Tudor 4, operating as the Star Tiger, was flying from the Azores to Bermuda when it stopped making contact. On board, 25 people. The weather was described by controllers as difficult but acceptable. The plane had not entered storm conditions. The last radio contact, calm, no sign of distress. Then silence. No wreckage, no signals. The British Ministry of Civil Aviation investigation ran for months and ended with a formulation that has become almost classic for stories from this region. The causes of the accident cannot be determined on the basis of available evidence. A year later, January 1949, a nearly identical story with a second aircraft from the same company. Tudor 4B, Flight Star Aerial, the same route, the same waters. 16 people. Again, no wreckage, no distress signal, no explanation. 2 aircraft, 1 airline, the same area of ocean, 1 year. This is no longer a coincidence in the ordinary sense. This is either something structural in the aircraft themselves, and that version was examined, or something in the conditions of flight over this specific stretch of the Atlantic in winter. The airline stopped flying this route. The Tudor 4 series was retired from service. There is a side of this story that is rarely discussed, a side connected not with what disappeared, but with what survived, and what we perhaps don't know how to read correctly. The radio transcripts from Flight 19 are partially preserved in the archives. Their transcriptions exist, and when you read them carefully, not as part of a legend, but simply as a document, something in them is difficult to explain by mechanical failure alone. Taylor says, "We don't know where we are." Another voice, "If we fly west, we'd get home." A pause. Taylor, "Don't know which way is west. Everything looks strange." Everything looks strange. This is a very odd phrase from an experienced pilot who had seen the sky for thousands of hours. What exactly looked strange? The color of the water? The angle of the horizon? Something in the movement of the clouds? We will never know what Charles Taylor saw in that December sky when his compass told him one thing and the ocean below him looked like something else. Some things go with the people who were their only witnesses. What we can say is this: every decision Taylor made in those final hours, declining to hand over command, leading the flight northeast rather than west, the specific choices under terrible uncertainty. All of it was made by a man who had been flying for years and who had just lost the most basic navigational tool available to him. In that moment, in that sky, with no GPS and no satellite and no automated position reporting, he was doing the best he knew how. And it wasn't enough. But it was human. The kind of human error that comes not from carelessness, but from a situation that simply exceeded the tools available. The tragedy of 1945 is partly a tragedy of technology, of instruments that didn't yet exist. Let us come back to the science one more time. To what we know with confidence, or believe we know. The Atlantic in the Triangle region has several features that distinguish it from most other bodies of water on Earth. First, the Gulf Stream. This warm surface current, up to 50 miles wide, moves through the triangle at up to 5 miles per hour, which, for an ocean current, is very fast. It can carry the debris of a sunken vessel 60 miles from the site of disaster overnight, putting it well outside any search perimeter. Second, depth. In the western part of the triangle, near the coasts of Florida and the Bahamas, the ocean floor drops from a few dozen feet to several miles within just a few miles of horizontal distance. This is the Bahamas Escarpment, one of the steepest underwater slopes in the world. If a ship sinks above it, it descends rapidly to great depth, and in earlier decades would have been effectively impossible to find. Third, the weather. This is one of the highest frequency regions in the world for waterspouts, columns of rotating air with winds up to 125 miles per hour that can appear in minutes and capsize a small vessel before it can transmit any distress call. And rogue waves. For most of the 20th century, scientists considered rogue waves single, massive walls of water, sometimes reaching 60 or 70 feet, to be sailors' mythology. Then, satellite radar was deployed, and it turned out that at any given moment in the Atlantic alone, between 10 and 20 such waves exist simultaneously. At the time of the early disappearances, there was no way to predict them, no way to detect them, and no way to survive one in a small vessel. I like thinking about the way science and legend are saying the same thing in different languages here. Science says powerful currents, deep underwater scarps, unpredictable weather, possible gas releases. Legend says something here takes ships and doesn't give them back. And if you translate the legend into the language of physical processes, it turns out to be accurate. Something here does take ships. The Gulf Stream takes the wreckage. The Bahamas Escarpment takes the sinking vessels down to 3 miles of depth. Waterspouts take small planes into the air and throw them back into the water. Rogue waves take everything. The difference is only that legend doesn't require precision. Science does. There is one more person whose story I cannot leave out, one who almost never appears in the standard accounts, though his disappearance belongs in this night. Joshua Slocum. In 1909, this Canadian-American sailor, the first person in history to circumnavigate the globe alone, sailed from Massachusetts on his small yawl toward the West Indies. He was planning another great voyage. Slocum was 65 years old. He was one of the most experienced sailors alive, a man who had lived at sea his entire adult life. His yawl was named Spray, and it had been his home for many years. Neither the Spray nor Joshua Slocum was ever seen again. This disappearance isn't usually included in the canonical lists of the triangle. He most likely simply went down somewhere in the Atlantic, as single-handed sailors sometimes did in those years. But occasionally he is mentioned, and in that one more person who went into that water and didn't come back, there is something that makes you think about the nature of chance, about when the number of coincidences becomes a pattern, and when it remains simply a number. Let me tell you about something that is almost never discussed when people talk about the Bermuda Triangle, about how exactly legends are born. Not what happened to the ships, but what happens in the minds of people when they hear about something that has no explanation. Psychologists call this apophenia, the tendency to see patterns where none exist. The human brain is evolutionarily wired for pattern recognition. It prefers a false pattern to no pattern at all. Better to see a tiger in the rustling of leaves and run away for nothing than to miss a real tiger and become its meal. For millions of years, this mechanism kept us alive, but it is also the same mechanism that makes us see faces in clouds, conspiracies in coincidences, and supernatural forces in lost aircraft. The Bermuda Triangle is apophenia in its purest form, say some researchers. People gathered unconnected events, drew a triangle on a map, and called it a phenomenon. Others respond, wait, apophenia is not the complete answer either, because there are stories that resist this explanation just as cleanly as one might wish. And again, we return to the three unclosed cases. The confirmation bias the researchers describe deserves a moment on its own, because it operates so smoothly we never catch it in the act. Consider how many ships have crossed the Bermuda Triangle in the past 200 years. Tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands. The same waters that produced the story of the Mary Celeste and Flight 19 have also produced utterly uneventful crossings by countless vessels, tankers and container ships, and sailing yachts and fishing boats, all of which arrived at their destination, offloaded their cargo, refueled, and departed again, having noticed nothing more unusual than some swell or a change in wind direction. These crossings don't appear in books. They don't become documentary films, because an ordinary crossing generates no story, and no story generates no memory, and no memory generates no data point in our informal count of things that happened in the triangle. Meanwhile, every disappearance, every vessel that sank, every aircraft that failed, in or near or arguably adjacent to the triangle, gets added to the count. This is how the triangle became famous, not through any unusual density of actual incidents, but through selective attention to the incidents that occurred. The brain is not malfunctioning when it does this. It is functioning exactly as designed, to notice and remember events that carry information about danger, and to ignore the uneventful routine that suggests safety. This worked extraordinarily well when the dangerous events were tigers, and the uneventful routine was no tiger today. It works less well when applied to ocean navigation statistics. Sometimes I think about Sophia Briggs, the 2-year-old girl her father brought along on the voyage in November 1872. She was too young to understand what the sea was. For her, it was simply a world that rocked, a large wooden room with windows through which there was always water and sometimes stars. What did she see in that night when something happened? Did she wake? Was she frightened? Or did she simply sleep while the adults around her did what they did? We will never know, and this specific, small, human unknowing is heavier than any theory. When we think about large catastrophes, about hundreds dead, about ships weighing thousands of tons, the mind protects itself with scale. Big numbers don't fit inside. But a 2-year-old girl in a wooden cabin, that fits. That arrives directly where the most real things arrive. I want to say something about the people who have devoted themselves to finding answers, because there is something particular in the stories of those who were pulled permanently into the triangle's orbit. Charles Berlitz published his book in 1974 and became a global celebrity. The book was translated into 30 languages and sold somewhere between 20 and 30 million copies. Berlitz was a linguist by training. He came from the family that founded the famous language schools, and he himself spoke dozens of languages fluently. Mysteries had always interested him. He wrote about lost civilizations, about Atlantis, about anomalies of all kinds. The Bermuda Triangle turned out to be the loudest of his stories. He spent years collecting accounts, meeting sailors and pilots, studying archives. He was criticized sharply. People said he distorted facts, that he exaggerated, that he was manufacturing myth from nothing. Berlitz responded, "I simply gathered what already existed. The stories were there before me. I only put a name to the space between them." And in that, he was right. He invented none of the ships. He invented none of the pilots. He simply gave a name to what lived in the silence between their stories. There is a figure in this story who preceded Berlitz and whose contribution tends to get lost in the shuffle. In 1964, a journalist named Vincent Gaddis published an article in Argosy magazine, a pulp adventure magazine with a long history of sensational stories, in which he first used the phrase Bermuda Triangle as a name for the region. He'd been collecting stories of Atlantic disappearances and drew a triangle around the ones that seemed to cluster. It was, in retrospect, not particularly rigorous geography. Many of the incidents he listed happened outside any reasonable triangle, and some didn't happen at all in the way he described them. But the name was irresistible. The Bermuda Triangle. 3 syllables, perfectly balanced. Specific enough to locate, abstract enough to carry whatever meaning you wanted to put in it. Gaddis followed the article with a book, Invisible Horizons, in 1965. Berlitz read it, expanded it, made it famous, and by 1974, the Bermuda Triangle had become one of the most recognized geographic names in the world. More recognizable than most actual cities, more discussed than most genuine mysteries. What is interesting about this is the speed of it. From Gaddis's article in 1964 to Berlitz's bestseller in 1974. 10 years. In 10 years, a region of ocean that had no collective name went from nameless to globally famous. Names matter. The triangle didn't become dangerous when Gaddis named it, but naming it allowed people to collect, count, compare, and argue about its incidents in a way that wasn't possible before. The name created the conversation, and the conversation created the legend, which then reached back in time and recruited all the incidents that had happened before the name existed, making them part of a story they hadn't known they were part of. And then there is Lawrence David Couchet, the researcher who spent years checking the archive record of every case. He came to the conclusion that the triangle was an illusion created by imprecision and exaggeration. His 1975 book, The Bermuda Triangle Mystery Solved, became the counter-argument to Berlitz's. What is interesting is that both books existed simultaneously. Both sold, both found their readers. People who wanted mystery read Berlitz. People who wanted debunking read Couchet. Both were right about something, both perhaps oversimplified. The truth, as usual, occupied that inconvenient space between them, where there is no clean answer. In the 1990s, when technology allowed underwater investigation far more effectively, a group of researchers attempted to find the wreckage of Flight 19. They surveyed the floor in the region of the estimated route. They found several World War II-era aircraft on the bottom, but not the right ones. TBM Avengers were a common aircraft type, and a number of them may lie on the Atlantic floor. Not only the 5 from Flight 19. Without hull numbers, identification is impossible. This too is a paradox of the triangle. Even if the wreckage of Flight 19 were found, it might not be the final answer, because the question, why, would remain. Why here? Why then? With 2 compasses that failed simultaneously, with 14 people of whom not one was ever found. A physical answer, coordinates, type of structural failure, sequence of events, is not the answer people are actually looking for. They are looking for meaning, and meaning is a different thing entirely. I want to tell you about one very small detail that I cannot get out of my head. Among the 14 crew members of Flight 19 was a young Marine named Robert Gallivan. He was 18 years old. He had just finished basic training. Flight 19 was one of his first training missions. 18 years old. A person who had barely begun living, who was just starting, who didn't yet know who he would become, where he would live, whom he would love, who on that December morning was probably thinking about none of this. Just a young man in uniform, sitting in a plane, preparing for a routine training flight over the Atlantic. 3 hours. Nothing unusual. That's what remains. Not theories, not triangles. 18 years old and 3 hours that never ended. I want to say something about time, about the way the same story looks entirely different depending on how far back you stand from it. Flight 19 disappeared in 1945. That is 80 years ago. The men who flew in those planes, if they had somehow survived, would be 100 years old today, or close to it. The world around that December flight has changed beyond recognition. The naval air stations of that era look like museum exhibits now. Aircraft of that era stand in aviation museums. The navigational technology that Charles Taylor had, a compass and a radio, has been replaced by systems that know their position to within a few feet, updated every second. And yet, December 5th, 1945, and March 4th, 1918, and November 7th, 1872, these dates stay alive because behind them stand people. And as long as people are remembered, dates live. In the US Navy archives, there are still folders with the cases of the USS Cyclops, of Flight 19, and several other vessels and aircraft. They are not classified. You can request them and receive them. They contain yellowed pages with facts and dates, cross-references to witnesses who have been dead for decades, maps with routes marked on them, photographs of people who never came back. The bureaucracy of loss, neatly organized into cardboard folders. And at the end of each file, one line typed on a typewriter by a careful clerk who probably gave it no more thought than any other line in any other report. Cause unknown. 2 words. They explain everything and explain nothing. There is also something else worth holding in mind about these people. They were not particularly remarkable before they became part of a legend. Benjamin Briggs was a working sea captain with a good reputation, competent, sober, reliable. Charles Taylor was a decent pilot with solid experience. The crew of the USS Cyclops were men doing their jobs in wartime. None of them were heroes in the conventional sense before whatever happened. They became part of history not through any special quality of their own, but through a particular intersection of circumstance, time, and place that none of them could have predicted or controlled. This is what makes these stories feel different from the stories of people who chose danger knowingly, explorers and mountaineers and test pilots. These people were on routine missions, familiar routes, nothing they had not done before. And something in the ordinary day went irreversibly wrong. The ocean does not remember. That is its nature. It does not store information in a form accessible to us. Water moves, mixes, changes temperature and direction. What entered it yesterday is not there today. The ocean is not cruel and not kind. It is simply very large and very old, and it operates by laws most of which we are only beginning to understand. Its silence is not deliberate. It is simply the silence of something very large that does not speak our languages. You can be angry at that silence. You can try to decode it. You can give it names: Bermuda Triangle, Sea of the Devil, the Devil's Islands. You can send expeditions, lower submersibles, launch satellites. And all of that is right. All of it is human. We are creatures that search for answers. This is not a flaw. It is the best thing about us. Sometimes, though, there is no answer. Or there is one, but it's not yet reachable. Or there is one, and we'll get there eventually, but not this night. When you leaf through maritime history journals from the past half-century, something curious appears. Every decade produces a new, definitive explanation for the Bermuda Triangle. The 1970s, Atlantis and extraterrestrials. The 1980s, human error and primitive navigation. The 1990s, statistical mythology. The 2000s, methane hydrates. The 2010s, underwater craters. Each version explains something. None explains everything. And this itself is an eloquent fact, not about the triangle, but about us, about how we search for answers, how we arrive at them, and how we eventually move past them. Science is not a building that gets built and at some point is finished. It is a conversation that continues. Each generation adds its line, and the next generation will change what seemed final to ours. This is comforting, because it means the story isn't over. Whatever happened to Flight 19, Whatever took the USS Cyclops into that March water, those stories may still have an ending. We just haven't reached it. We need a little more time, a slightly better instrument, a slightly different angle of vision. Let me tell you about what exists on the sea floor of the Triangle region right now. Because this is a living, continuing story. Oceanographers using sophisticated sonar in the late 20th century discovered that the sea floor in the western part of the Triangle, particularly near the Bahama Banks, is far more complex than anyone had realized. There are trenches, irregular deep formations, valleys in the ocean floor that drop suddenly for thousands of feet. The expected smooth continental shelf simply isn't there in places. Instead, something closer to a lunar landscape, sudden chasms, sharp ridges, collapsed formations. These irregular features create specific currents that can move objects upward from depth, or, conversely, pull them downward with unexpected force. And then there are the blue holes, enormous cylindrical voids dropping vertically into the sea floor, sometimes hundreds of feet deep. The most famous is the Blue Hole off the coast of Belize in the Caribbean, a near-perfect circle more than 900 feet across and over 400 feet deep, visible from the air as a dark disk of improbably deep blue in otherwise shallow turquoise water. Similar structures have been found in other parts of this region. They formed during the Ice Age, when sea levels were much lower and these locations were dry land, caves and sinkholes on the Earth's surface. Then the water rose and flooded them. They still stand there today, in complete darkness, in complete silence, preserved from the air they once contained. I find myself thinking about the blue holes as a kind of metaphor. When the water rose and drowned those caves, the information about what existed inside them went under too. Nobody saw, nobody knew. They simply stood there in the dark, waiting until people had precise enough instruments to find them. How many things like this surround us? How many structures, physical, historical, that exist but are invisible because we don't yet have the right instrument? The Bermuda Triangle is, in a certain sense, a story about instruments, about the fact that we can only see what we have tools to see, and that each generation has slightly better tools and sees slightly more. The next generation will see more still. When you think about the Bermuda Triangle for a long time, longer than one article or one documentary allows, you begin to notice that behind all the theories, behind all the debates about methane hydrates and weather anomalies and human error, there is one large question. Not about the triangle, about ourselves. Why do we need unexplained places? Why does a world without mysteries feel smaller to us, poorer, less alive? Why, when scientists say, statistically, this region is no more dangerous than any other, do we feel something resembling disappointment? Even those of us who don't believe in extraterrestrials, who don't believe in Atlantis, who are perfectly ready to accept any rational explanation. Perhaps because mystery is a form of space, a place where you can exist without knowing the answer, a place where the world is larger than you. Most things in our lives are arranged so that there is an answer, or soon will be, or can be found in 30 seconds. We live inside a dense network of explanations, and sometimes what's needed is a place where the network ends, where the water simply goes down and no one knows what's there. The Bermuda Triangle is such a place. Even if every specific disappearance eventually receives a specific explanation, the triangle as an idea, as an image, as a dark patch on the map will remain, because we need it. The night outside is as dark as deep water. Your thoughts are not as sharp as they were at the beginning. They have softened, become blurrier, the way a shoreline blurs through fog. This is right. This is exactly what should be happening now. The mind is releasing the details and holding only the overall image. Large water, dark and calm, infinite in both directions. Somewhere in that water, the triangle stands, invisible, drawn in imagination, existing only because we agreed that it does. 3 points, 3 lines, 1 name. And in that name, all the stories we tell ourselves about a world that is larger than us, about places that don't know us, about depth that has no floor for our understanding. The water in the Bermuda Triangle is the same color as everywhere else at this hour, nearly black, small waves. Somewhere out there, a container ship moves, with its mast lights burning, and its captain is looking at a chart and thinking about something of his own, about home, or the next port. And beneath him, 4 miles of water, and all of it is just an ordinary night on an ordinary route. Nothing mysterious, just the sea. Just the sea, which is very large, which owes us nothing. And there is something, I think, that is genuinely worth holding, not as a consolation, but as a true thing. The ocean is not hostile to us. It is not indifferent in the way a bureaucrat is indifferent, or in the way a stranger is indifferent. It is indifferent in the way gravity is indifferent. It operates by its own principles, which have nothing to do with human needs or human presence, and never have. We enter the ocean as guests. We always have been guests. The ancient sailors knew this. They named the waters and gave them personalities, not because they believed the sea was literally alive, but because giving a thing a name and a character is how you hold it in your mind well enough to navigate it. The sea could be angered. The sea could be appeased. The sea had moods and preferences. This was not superstition. This was the beginning of oceanography, the close, daily, observational knowledge of how water behaves, accumulated over thousands of years by people whose lives depended on getting it right. The sea monster on the edge of an old map was not ignorance. It was a way of marking the territory of the unknown, of saying, here is where our knowledge ends. Past here, we have only stories. The Bermuda Triangle is the 21st century's version of that sea monster. Not a lie, a marker. This is where the stories live. Just the sea, which is very large, which owes us nothing, which holds in itself everything that has entered it, and keeps silent about it with a silence that has no bottom. The ships that went into it, the Mary Celeste and the USS Cyclops and all the others, they are now part of that floor. Or not. Nobody knows. Perhaps this is the most honest answer that can be given to the question of the Bermuda Triangle. Some things, having gone to the depth, simply stop being ours. They become oceanic, and the ocean does not report back. This is not frightening. It is simply very, very large. Right now, somewhere far away, 5,000 kilometers and more than 100 years, the Atlantic is moving in the dark. The same water that received the Mary Celeste, the same water that closed over the USS Cyclops, the same water that caught the 5 torpedo bombers descending toward it on a December afternoon, the same water that was there before any of these events and that continues to move now, independent of all of them, indifferent in the way only something genuinely old can be indifferent. The water in the Bermuda Triangle right now is the same water it was in 1872, in 1918, in 1945. Water moves and cycles and evaporates and returns. But the Atlantic basin holds the same water continuously, the same molecules redistributed, the same ocean. It doesn't carry memory the way stone does, or ice, or sediment, but it carries physics. It carries current and temperature and the particular geometry of the ocean floor. Whatever physical mechanisms contributed to those disappearances, the gas vents, the steep underwater escarpment, the Gulf Stream, the rogue waves, those mechanisms are still there, still operating on the same principles they operated on before anyone gave the place a name. The triangle is imaginary. The water is real. And the water is busy. Right now, somewhere far away, 5,000 kilometers and more than 100 years, the Atlantic is moving in the dark. The same water as always, the same stars above it, the same silence in the depths below. Somewhere up there, an airplane is flying. Passenger, large, with hundreds of people on board. Some of them are sleeping. Some are looking out the window into the darkness in which nothing is visible, only the occasional lights of ships far below. The pilots in the cockpit are watching their instruments. The instruments show everything precisely: coordinates, altitude, heading, speed, fuel remaining. The aircraft is flying over the same place where 70 years ago 5 torpedo bombers flew with nothing but a compass. That is the main change. Not that the world has become less mysterious, but that we have become better equipped not to get lost in it. Almost. Because the mysteries haven't gone anywhere. They have simply moved to where our instruments don't yet reach, into the depths of the sea floor, into the history of archives, into the space between what happened and what we know about it. Your thoughts are growing quieter. The body has been still for some time now, long enough that the details are beginning to dissolve. The specific dates, the specific aircraft designations, the specific depths and percentages and archival references. What remains is something softer, an impression, a feeling of having been near something very large. That is the right relationship to have with the ocean. Near it, aware of it, respectful of its scale, but not defined by it, not diminished by it. The ships that disappeared in those waters were carrying people who had full lives, full relationships, full futures planned out in their minds. They weren't defined by their disappearance either, even if that is the only lens through which we can see them now. Briggs was a husband and a father and an experienced seaman who loved the work. Taylor was a young pilot building a career. Gallivan was 18 years old, beginning everything. What the ocean took is real, but it is not the whole of what those people were. They existed before the water. They were more than the mystery their disappearance created. We remember them as mysteries because that is all that reached us. But they were people before they were mysteries. Your thoughts are growing quieter. Images drift. An empty ship with an open music book. A December sky over Florida. The dark hull of a great vessel sliding into black water without a sound. All of this is very far away, 5,000 miles and more than 100 years. And not frightening now, not at all, as you lie in the dark and your breathing is this even, this slow, like the movement of water on a quiet night. Let the ocean keep its secrets. There is a strange comfort in a mystery that has lasted this long and will likely last longer still. In a world where most information is available instantly, where satellite imaging can resolve objects less than a foot across, where every phone can find itself on the globe to within a few yards, the Bermuda Triangle remains, stubbornly, a place where things went in and didn't come back, and we don't entirely know why. This is not a reason for anxiety. It is something closer to a reminder. Think of what has been found in the ocean in recent years. The wreck of the Titanic, located in 1985 after 73 years on the sea floor. The wreck of the Bismarck, found in 1989. The wreck of the USS Central America, a 19th century steamship whose gold cargo was located in the 1980s after more than a century. Each of these had been written off as beyond finding. Each turned out to be findable, given the right technology and the right search strategy and the right funding. What this tells us is not that everything lost at sea will eventually be found. It tells us that the timeline of underwater discovery is much longer than any of us live to see. The ocean gives things back on its own schedule, which may be decades or centuries or never, depending on depth and current and the peculiarities of the specific seafloor at the specific location. The wreckage of Flight 19, if it is down there, is waiting in the same place it has been since December 1945. It is not disappearing. It is simply in water too deep and too dark for our current tools to have found it. Future tools may find it. Future researchers may have the funding to search the right area with the right resolution. History is not finished. The ocean is patient. We are still in the early chapters of what we know about what lies beneath. This is not a reason for anxiety. It is something closer to a reminder that the world is larger than our current instruments, that there are still things the ocean holds that it hasn't chosen to release, that we don't know is still a legitimate answer and not a failure. The researchers who study the deep ocean, the ones with ROVs and sonar and years of patience, They don't speak about the Atlantic the way the documentaries do. They speak about it with a kind of reverence that comes from genuinely knowing how much they don't know. Every descent reveals something unexpected. Every comprehensive survey turns up formations that weren't on any previous chart. The ocean is not withholding things from us deliberately. It is simply very old and very large, and under no obligation to make itself legible. The fact that we've learned as much as we have is, viewed honestly, more surprising than the gaps. Let the ocean keep its secrets. Let the triangle stand where it stands, invisible, imaginary, real. Let Flight 19 remain where it is, in the archives, in the books, in the night conversations where nobody knows the answer, but everyone knows the question. Some things don't need an answer to be real. Somewhere in the archives of the US Navy, there is a photograph of Flight 19 taken at Fort Lauderdale on December 5th, 1945. 5 aircraft on the tarmac, 14 men around them, some posing, some looking away, some squinting in the Florida sun. They don't know what is going to happen in a few hours. They are thinking about lunch, or about the flight, or about nothing in particular. They are just standing in a photograph in the December sun. This is the last image we have of them as living people in their ordinary context, on the ground, in the world, without knowledge of what was ahead. I find myself returning to this thought. Every person in every disaster story, every person in every archive, had a moment like this just before. A moment of not knowing, of being ordinary, of thinking about something else entirely. The Mary Celeste photograph from its last port shows the ship at dock. Ropes, masts, the ordinary busyness of departure preparation. The USS Cyclops was photographed in Barbados, its last port, surrounded by the ordinariness of loading and provisioning. Ordinary days, at the end of which extraordinary things happened. There is something in this that isn't sad exactly, or not only sad. It is something about the way our ordinary days are connected to everything that follows them. The way each unremarkable morning is the last morning before whatever comes next. We don't feel this in the ordinary morning. We only see it in retrospect. The photograph from December 5th, 1945, with 14 men in the Florida sun, only became what it is because of what happened afterward. Some things don't need an answer to be real. Facts speak of the physical world. Legends speak of ourselves. What the Bermuda Triangle legend tells us about ourselves is not unflattering. It tells us that we are creatures who notice absence, who find the missing thing more compelling than the present thing, who are more curious about what the ocean doesn't return than about what it does. This is not morbidity. It is an expression of something essentially human. The refusal to treat loss as final, the insistence on understanding, the belief that if we ask the question in the right way, the answer will eventually come. It has been asking that question for a century and a half, since Morehouse's men climbed aboard the Mary Celeste and found the sewing machine and the open music book and the food nearly ready on the table. Since then, some answers have come, partial ones, plausible ones, none entirely satisfying. And the question has not stopped being asked. New instruments, new techniques, new researchers each decade. The conversation continues, not because we expect to find the people they are beyond finding, but because the process of inquiry itself has value. Because the willingness to keep asking, what happened, is the willingness to insist that what happened mattered. And it did. Each one of them mattered. The first officer of the Mary Celeste, the cook on the USS Cyclops, Gallivan, 18 years old, the 25 people on the Star Tiger. All of them mattered. The asking keeps them in the conversation. Facts speak of the physical world. Legends speak of ourselves. And in the end, we need both to understand where we are. If this was with you tonight, pass it to someone who also finds the night long sometimes. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it so the next one finds you. Good night.
Thank